Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, today's chapters are 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and 2 Chronicles 32. Now in 2 Chronicles 32 we've got Hezekiah, and we're reminded at the end of Hezekiah's life that he was on his sickbed. I'm here in my bedroom, and I know that this is where I crawl when things aren't going well for me. Hezekiah was on his sickbed. He calls out to God, and God intervenes. If you read the same account in 2 Kings, you will see that he actually had sepsis, and he had to take this poultice of figs, is what God told him to do, and put it on that. But anyway, God used that to answer his prayer. In addition, we see at the end of Hezekiah's life that he was proud. This is what this verse says. And God got sickness, and he got hardship to arrest his attention, to humble himself before God again. But the most part of that chapter is the Assyrian general Sennacherib arrives, and he's got a mighty army. And Hezekiah quickly jumped into gear, strategic man that he was, blocked up the water duct so that this invading army didn't have any water, repaired the wall, built another wall around his existing wall, and made some weapons, called his people together, gave a great rallying speech. But Sennacherib was a nasty piece of work. He came in and tried to divide the people from Hezekiah. And he made Hezekiah terrified, actually. And Hezekiah goes before the Lord, and he intercedes and he prays with the prophet Isaiah. And what happens is that the angel of the Lord comes and wipes out the Assyrian army, and the remnants, retreat back into Assyria. It's a great chapter, but it's a chapter of God's dealings with a good man, and a good man getting proud, and that proud man humbling himself, and God answering his prayer. There's a lot to take from this chapter, but it's 2 Corinthians chapter 6 that I want to focus on right now. Paul says, as God's co-workers, we urge you not to receive God's grace in vain. He's basically saying, when you got saved, you received God's grace. In other words, his favor. You didn't deserve it. You didn't ask for it first. He came after you, and he saved you. And he describes how that happened. He says, in the time of my favor, I heard you. In the day of salvation, I helped you. So he's basically saying, you didn't save yourself. I helped you. I saved you. And then he says this, now I tell you, the time of the Lord's favor is now. And now is the day of salvation. So he's basically saying, you know how you needed God's grace to be saved? Well, you need God's grace and his favor to persist. He said, I don't want you to receive grace in vain. Vain would mean you just receive his grace to be saved, and now you're going to make it to heaven, but that's got nothing more to do with the rest of your life. He says, no. Just like you needed his grace and favor to save you, you have a purpose to become Christ-like. And if you don't see that, then it's vanity. Then God's grace is not being worked out in your life. So what does that mean? He's basically saying your heart is going to be transformed. It has been saved now, but it's going to be transformed. And as more of God comes into it, it's changed. And then he uses this example. He says, basically, you should open it up to some people and close it off to others, people who also walk in the grace of God. So he's basically saying, make room in your heart for me. He says, I long for you. I've got a love for you. And follow people like me. Allow people like me into your heart. We carry the grace of God, and it's good for you. And then he says, but also, don't open your heart so wide that you just get everybody in there, because there's some people you shouldn't be allowing in. Close it off to them. He's saying, what does light have to do with darkness? He's basically saying, don't be unequally yoked, which is saying basically in your marriage, in some business dealings. He says, don't let those guys run into your heart, because they bring with them not only their idolatry, but a misunderstanding of God's grace, a misunderstanding of God. And this is what it's about. He says you've been saved for a purpose, and that purpose is to be transformed into Christ-likeness. He's basically saying, I can help you. Others are going to be harmful to you. Be careful who you open your heart up to.